Today, your lesson question is, how did the United States turn the tide in the Pacific? When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they hoped to destroy the bulk of the United States Pacific Fleet. They did, in fact, inflict enormous damage, sinking 21 ships, including 4 battleships. But the Japanese weren't as successful as they had hoped to be. 3 U.S. aircraft carriers that made up the heart of the fleet were not at Pearl Harbor that day and so escaped destruction. In the days ahead, the fleet would reorganize around these carriers, and America would begin its assault at sea. In May 1942, the Japanese were in command of the war and pressing their advantage. Japan sent a fleet to attack Port Moresby on the island of New Guinea, which could be used as a base from which to attack Australia. U.S. intelligence learned of the Japanese plans, and a combined battle group of U.S. and Australian warships intercepted the Japanese fleet. The Battle of the Coral Sea followed. The battle was fought by carrier-based warplanes. It took place over a wide expanse of the Coral Sea. It was the first naval battle ever in which the warring ships were never within sight of each other. Each side lost a carrier, and other warships were badly damaged. There was no clear victor, but Japan lost many aircraft. Without those planes, Japan had to call off the attack on Port Moresby, and with it, any chance of a direct attack on Australia. The battle represented a first for the Allies and marked a turning point in the war up to that time. For the first time in the war, Japan was denied victory. The Battle of the Coral Sea was a setback for Japan, but it still had a major advantage over the U.S. in ships and warplanes. In early June 1942, a large Japanese task force under Admiral Yamamoto headed for a showdown with America's still rebuilding fleet. That showdown was the Battle of Midway. Japan had planned to surprise U.S. forces by seizing the American island of Midway, pictured here, to use as an airbase. But U.S. intelligence had broken the Japanese Navy's code and deciphered radio messages laying out Yamamoto's plan. The information allowed U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz to ambush the oncoming Japanese task force, and American warplanes attacked the Japanese while the fleet was still hundreds of miles from Midway. Like the Battle of the Coral Sea, Midway was fought entirely by warplanes. Wave after wave of bombers attacked the Japanese, who launched their own attacks against the U.S. carriers and the base on Midway Island. The Battle of Midway proved to be a key turning point in the war. The battle began on June 4, 1942, and continued for 3 days. Unlike the Battle of the Coral Sea, this battle was a decided victory for the United States. The U.S. sank all 4 of the Japanese carriers involved in the battle. Japan also lost 300 warplanes and around 3,000 men. The U.S. lost 1 carrier, 150 planes, and about 300 men. Up until the Battle of Midway, Japan had a numerical advantage in ships and planes. This battle evened out the naval strength of the 2 powers. Unlike the U.S. with its vast resources, Japan would not be able to replace its losses. Its navy could no longer continue to advance across the Pacific. Now, the U.S. could go on the attack in the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz led U.S. forces in the Pacific. He became Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet about 3 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Much to the displeasure of a Congress who wanted immediate results following the Japanese attack, Nimitz took his time as he oversaw the rebuilding of the disabled fleet. He was not necessarily a cautious leader, but he refused to rush into battle until he knew the Navy and Marines under his command were properly equipped and fully armed, supplied, and trained. Admiral Nimitz was a brilliant strategist who played a major role in developing the key strategies for winning the war. He implemented the strategy at sea as he led the fleet to victory in major battles, including the Battle of Midway. Let's take a look again at the lesson question. How did the United States turn the tide in the Pacific? You already know that by June 1942, the United States had turned the tide of the war, stopping the Japanese advance in the Battle of the Coral Sea and then crippling Japan's navy at Midway. Following the victory in the Battle of Midway, the United States went on the offensive. The goal was to push the Japanese backward and recapture islands that had been taken over by Japan. Slowly, island by island, the U.S. would advance toward the Japanese mainland itself. U.S. forces began pushing back against Japan 2 months after their victory in the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Guadalcanal began in August of 1942. Japan had previously captured the small island of Guadalcanal and had begun building an airbase there for attacking Allied ships. The United States decided to capture the island. A major air, naval, and land battle followed. Guadalcanal was the first major Allied offensive of the war, and it was a brutal battle. The fighting raged on land, at sea, and in the air. The battle lasted 6 months and was enormously costly for both sides. Japan lost 24,000 soldiers. U.S. losses were lighter, though 1,600 were killed and 4,200 injured. Thousands more U.S. fighters were lost to tropical illnesses. It was the first blow that forced the Japanese to begin a long retreat toward their mainland. From this point on, Japan was on the defensive. Following the victory at Guadalcanal, the United States continued on the offensive. The U.S. strategy was called island hopping. The U.S. would invade and recapture islands that had strategic importance, bypassing those that were unimportant, then attack Japan from the newly gained territory. In carrying out their strategy, the U.S. used amphibious landings to storm the beaches. In an amphibious landing, ground troops are sent ashore from ships. Infantry are brought close to shore and then put on specialized landing vessels to reach the beaches. U.S. forces developed a high level of skill in amphibious landings. As they hopped from island to island, the U.S. bypassed many Japanese strongholds and cut them off from supplies. The Japanese troops that occupied them were left to sit out the rest of the war on their islands. Island hopping speeded up the war and saved the lives of countless U.S. servicemen who would have been killed trying to capture islands that had no strategic importance. Let's take a look again at the lesson question for today. How did the United States turn the tide in the Pacific? You know now that the United States and its allies permanently stopped the Japanese advance at Guadalcanal. With that victory, they seized the initiative and began using an island hopping strategy to push the Japanese back toward their homeland. In this final section, you'll see how the American strategy paid off as they recaptured islands lost in the first months of the war and pushed on to the doorstep of Japan itself. You will then learn how the U.S. used an atomic weapon to end the war in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, pictured here, was stationed in the Philippines at the beginning of the war. He commanded a stubborn defense of the islands when the Japanese attacked on December 7, 1941. He fought a strong and effective delaying strategy against superior forces, for which he was later awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Near the end, when he was bottled up on the tiny island of Corregidor, MacArthur was recalled by President Roosevelt to become commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur reluctantly left his forces behind to assume his new duties, but he declared that "I shall return." He spent the next 3 years of the war fighting to keep that promise. During that time, he led American ground forces in driving the Japanese from New Guinea, the Admiralty Islands, and other islands of the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur kept his promise to return when he recaptured the Philippines in 1944, one of the steps in the American island hopping strategy. The Allies were inching closer to victory. After recapturing the Philippines, the U.S. moved on to attack the island of Iwo Jima. It proved to be one of the most costliest American victories in the Pacific. The Americans wanted to capture Iwo Jima to use as an airbase to attack Japan. It was located just 750 miles from the main islands, an easy flight for U.S. bombers. But Iwo Jima was not just significant for military reasons. It was also the first piece of Japanese territory to be invaded by Allied ground troops. The U.S. attacked Iwo Jima in February 1945 with bombs, rockets, and naval guns. Eventually, they launched an amphibious attack with hundreds of ships and more than 100,000 soldiers. More than 25,000 Americans were killed or wounded. The Japanese regarded Iwo Jima as part of their homeland. It is a volcanic island with many caves and rough terrain, making it easy to defend. 20,000 Japanese soldiers dug in and fortified it with a maze of tunnels. And they fought a battle to the death. They planned to have no survivors. The Japanese lost almost all of the 20,000 men that were there to defend the island. Just 216 were taken alive as prisoners of war. One of the strategies the Japanese began using in the final year of the war were kamikaze attacks, suicide attacks carried out by Japanese pilots. As 1945 progressed, Japan grew increasingly desperate. Kamikaze attacks began in October 1944 and grew more and more frequent as the war progressed and the U.S. got nearer to the main Japanese islands. Kamikazes were effective in damaging and sinking ships and killing American servicemen. Kamikaze attacks made an impression on American military leaders. They began to understand that the Japanese would fight even more fiercely for their home islands, and the cost in U.S. lives would be very high. The final target of U.S. island hopping was Okinawa, which lay just 350 miles from Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands. It would be an excellent location for a base from which to attack Japan's main islands. The Allies had been bombing Okinawa since October 1944, but like Iwo Jima, it would be a difficult battle. It was defended by 100,000 Japanese soldiers. The U.S. attacked the island in April 1945. 60,000 U.S. troops landed on the beaches in the largest American amphibious landing of the war in the Pacific. The Japanese fought back with kamikaze air raids and employed a huge kamikaze battleship, the Yamato, which only had enough fuel for a one-way trip. The Battle of Okinawa, which ended on July 2nd, 1945, resulted in extremely heavy casualties for both sides. 12,000 Americans were killed, along with more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers. Along with all of the Japanese and American military servicemen who died, up to 100,000 civilians living on the island were also killed. It was a huge cost in lives, but Japan's home islands were now within reach, and with it, an end to the long war. But what would be the cost? With the victories on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, questions arose for America. How could the war be finally ended? How many U.S. servicemen would die if America invaded Japan? U.S. military leaders feared that a traditional invasion might cost more than 100,000 American lives. Were there any alternatives? The answer to this question came in the form of the atomic bombs that the U.S. dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The U.S. dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Between 70,000 and 100,000 people were killed in Hiroshima. Tens of thousands more died in the following months and years. It is important to note that in the month of April, more than 100,000 Japanese civilians in Tokyo were killed using traditional bombs. Despite the destruction, Japan refused to surrender. The second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. Approximately 40,000 people were killed in Nagasaki in the initial blast. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender over the objections of many Japanese military leaders.